Good morning. Okay. How to Train Your Dragon, How to Speak Dragonese, Chapter 9. Welcome to Fort Sinister. The kidnappers ran down the hillside with the boys bumping on their backs. They threw them into the bottom of their boat, which was a small, clearly Roman ship with a very badly made bog burglar flag flying from the mast. The kidnappers set sail in the opposite direction to the land of the bog burglars. "Where are we going?" moaned Fishlegs. "My guess is next stop Fort Sinister," replied Hiccup. "Your weedy friend? She is right," sneered the first kidnapper, removing his false beard. "You are having the honour to be kidnapped by the glorious Empire of Rome, and we is taking you to the noble fortress of Sinister." "Yippee," said Fishlegs gloomily. Well, I said that in the wrong way, didn't I? "Yippee," said Fishlegs gloomily. "You can be shuttings up now," said the first kidnapper, and the boys shut up. The wind was very strong. Within an hour, they had left the safety of Woden's bathtub and were entering the tricksy currents and needle-sharp rocks of the mazy multitudes. This was a bewildering muddle of thousands of small islands, some miles south of the Isle of Burke, many with gigantic sea cliffs. Its eerie atmosphere led most Vikings to believe that it was haunted. Huge black mountains with grim scrabbles of rock rose on either side of them. The greasy sea swirled underneath, with every now and then a pointy rock appearing out of nowhere in the mist, so that the second kidnapper had to swiftly steer the boat clear. The closer they'd got to the Roman headquarters, the less wildlife there was around them. Woden's bathtub had been alive with dragons of all shapes and sizes, screaming and catcalling to each other and skimming across the waves, keeping an eye out for fish. Seals slumbered flatly. Oh, not flatly. Fatly. Quite like that word. Fatly on the rocks. Birds wheeled in the skies, zooming down on any morsels of fish that went astray during dragon fights. But as they neared the fort, the seas around them became a desert. Not a bird called, not a fish jumped. The reason for this was clear when they spotted 2 dead slitherhawks, all tangled up in a gigantic net, hanging from a cliff face. "And they call us barbarians," sniffed Fishlegs. Hiccup began to feel a bit sick, and then his heart skipped a beat. He could hear the sound of dragons screaming, the same noise that they had heard through the mist in Woden's bathtub. It was a sound that chilled the blood and frayed the nerves like a sword being sharpened screechily on a stone. He swallowed hard. "I think we're about to meet the Romans," he said. And here is a picture of Fort Sinister. It looks like there's a hot air balloons, doesn't there? They can't be. Hot air balloons weren't invented until the 1700s, nearly 1,700 years after the Romans. Anyway, Sure enough, the appalling hullabaloo of terrified and furious dragons grew louder and louder and louder, and then they rounded a corner, and before them, impossibly huge and spooky, stood Fort Sinister. Their mouths flopped open in astonishment. Vikings are used to fairly simple living conditions. A chief just has a larger hut than anybody else, so they'd never seen anything the size of Fort Sinister before. The island of Sinister was surrounded by enormous black cliffs, plunging dizzily down to jagged rocks. On top of these cliffs, the Romans had built the biggest fort you could possibly imagine, covering the entire island. The wind shrieked through its awful towers and great grim cages. The sea seeped through its iron gates and into its terrible dungeons. It was a fort as black and bleak as the rocks that it was made out of. In the middle was the consul's palace, a gorgeous villa built around a central courtyard with an ornamental fountain. Next to the palace was an enormous wooden amphitheatre. An amphitheatre is a circular Roman theatre. If you think of the Colosseum in Rome, that's an amphitheatre. And beyond that were the soldiers' barracks. Countless numbers of dragons were being held in 50 enormous iron cages, with no shelter from the wild wind and bitter cold of the inner aisles. No wonder they were screaming. Beyond that were slaves' quarters and kitchens and exercise yards for the horses and training grounds for the gladiators and little temples for the gods and heated swimming pools for the consul, swimming baths rather, for the consul and senior soldiers, as well as stores of ammunition and gigantic equipment for breaking a barricade and field after field of crops. And this entire massive area was encircled by high wooden fences, with watchtowers manned by sentries every 100 metres. 4 enormous observation balloons sailed overhead. These balloons were powered by the flaming breath of a dragon kept in a cage just above the basket, and they were manned with more sentries keeping a sharp eye out for escapees or invaders. Okay, so we have to be careful. Okay, I know we're learning about the Romans in our history lessons. We have to be aware that this isn't factual. Okay, this is a story. So it weaves certain facts about Romans, being great soldiers and with fantastical elements. For instance, hot air balloons kept afloat by dragons. Okay, I know you know the difference between fact and fiction. Wow, breathed Fishlegs at last. No wonder the Romans have conquered most of the world. It's just amazing that they haven't actually conquered us. Yet, said Hiccup grimly. What I'm worrying about is how on earth we're going to get out of here. The kidnappers sailed right up to the wooden entrance gates. These were in themselves impossibly huge. They were doors larger than some of the sea cliffs on Burke. And as they neared, there were cries from the sentries in the watchtowers, and the great doors opened to let them in. They sailed through the open gates, right into the heart of the fortress, and the doors shutting behind them were like the closing of a shark's mouth. The second kidnapper gave the boys a glittering smile as they moored the boat. "We is welcoming you to Fort Sinister," he said. And there it is. I'll move it a bit closer. Okay, chapter 10, the secret identity of the Thin Prefect. The kidnappers threw the boys over their shoulders again and strode through several large courtyards, busy with soldiers and cooks and horses and people selling things to each other. They walked up some steps and through a door into a brightly lit, gorgeously painted room. This was the consul's palace. Tapestries hung from the walls, couches were draped in silken covers, and the mosaic floor was warm and toasty underfoot. The Romans certainly knew how to make themselves comfy. In one corner of the room, the fat consul was having his tonsils tickled with a feather so he could vomit and fit in some more monstrous nightmare creme brulee for pudding. In another, the Thin Prefect was having his temples massaged. He looked up when they came in and gave an aha of evil satisfaction. At the prefect's feet lay a particularly large gronkel. And that's a dragon about 2 meters high with a spiny ruff around its neck. When they came into the room, it heaved its enormous bulk onto its thick, muscly legs, and an ominous growling began deep in its thick, bull neck. It leaped at the first kidnapper, who dropped Fishlegs with a scream. "Stop!" shouted the thin prefect in Dragonese. Very poor Dragonese, but Dragonese nonetheless. The Gronkel had grabbed the first kidnapper by the leg in his immense jaws, and the first kidnapper uselessly drummed his fists on the gigantic creature's great warty back. The Gronkel had been enjoying itself, gnawing away at the kidnapper's knee, its great tail lashing from side to side. But at the thin prefect's command, it reluctantly stopped. "Thank you." The thin prefect had a terrible accent, and he kept on getting the words wrong. "You can hold on to the kidnapper now." The Gronkel didn't move. "I said, hold on to him," shouted the thin prefect crossly. The Gronkel blinked at him and still didn't move. "Oh, for Thor's sake, you stupid alligator," swore the thin prefect in Norse. Norse is the language of the Vikings. From his pocket, he got out his half of How to Speak Dragonese and started to flick through it, muttering to himself, "Release, release. What's the word for release?" "I think you'll find the word is release, sir," advised Hiccup politely. In the book, it's obvious. It's not obvious when I'm reading it, but in the book, whenever Dragonese is spoken, it's written like in a different font. It's written in a different style. So, "I think you'll find the word is release, sir," advised Hiccup politely. So Hiccup is saying the word release in Dragonese. "Thank you," sneered the prefect. He said the word to the Gronkel, who opened its jaws, and the kidnapper dropped, sprawling onto the floor. "As you can see," drawled the thin prefect, "I need the other half of your book, Hiccup." Hiccup tried not to look as terrified as he felt. "How do you know my name?" he asked. "And why are we speaking in Norse, not in Latin?" The thin prefect smiled. "We've met before, you see, Hiccup. Many, many times. Why don't you look a little closer?" Hiccup looked up into the thin prefect's eyes, and he gasped as he finally realized who it was. The man was bald, completely hairless all over, and even his eyelashes had disappeared. But bald as he was, and dressed in a toga, this was definitely Hiccup's arch-enemy. Alvin the Treacherous, chief of the outcast tribe and the wickedest man in the Inner Isles. We met Alvin in the first book, didn't we? "So," hissed Alvin, "we meet again. Hiccup Horrendous Haddock III." Hiccup and Fishlegs gazed at him in utter astonishment. The last time they had seen Alvin, he'd been inside the stomach of the monstrous strangulator at the bottom of the underground sea cavern. That's the first book that we read. How on earth had he got out of that tricky situation? And what was he doing, posing as a Roman? "I see you're wondering," smiled Alvin nastily, "how I got myself out of that tricky situation." Fishlegs and Hiccup nodded. "It's an interesting story," spat Alvin, his eyes hissing with fury. "Now, I know you'll enjoy it. I cut myself out of the stomach of the dead monstrous strangulator with my sword. And then since you had so kindly abandoned me without any dragons, I couldn't get out of the cavern by the sea." "We didn't abandon you," squeaked Fishlegs. "We didn't know you were alive. How could we know?" Alvin ignored him. "So I had no choice but to go through the Caliban caves. 3 whole months it took me, creeping through the darkness, eating little cavern dragons raw, licking the walls for water. And then when I finally emerged into the light on your vile little island and stole a ship back to my own land, what happens? My own people shun me. They refuse to have me as their chief. Because down there in the darkness, in the vile belly of that strangulator, something happened to me. Alvin's voice became more and more savage. The stomach juices of that infernal creature have made my hair fall out, and whoever has heard of a hairless Viking? I was thrown out of my own tribe and forced into exile. Luckily, I have some Roman blood on my mother's father's side, and the Empire has use for a clever person like myself. I told them I'd thought of a way that they could conquer the Vikings by turning the tribes against each other. Traitor! Yelled Fishlegs. Exactly, smiled Alvin, and I also have my own plans for a dragon army. Alvin drew his right arm out of his toga for the first time, an arm that ended not in a hand, but in a huge curved hook made out of the most brilliant gold. Okay, that was a long part one. That was 16 minutes. Okay.